Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Misty and Arshad, and Mahesh and Lorenzo, Wade, Jack. Great to see all of you. Hope you're excited for the weekend, and of course, another masterclass. Masterclass number 104 is about to kick off. So let's go ahead and hop over to my screen. If you've been following me on Instagram, I think I posted this on Twitter, and also I made a YouTube video on the Super Ellipse plugin, which we might get to today. You may have seen that I've been designing a smart thermostat. This little guy here, a little bit, skeuomorphic, a little bit realistic, has some depth to it. Nice lighting, shadows, all that fun stuff. We're going to be creating this today. Hopefully we'll be able to get through the entire thing, because next week I do want to move on to another project, but we're going to try to get as much done of this as we can today, and hopefully you can all follow along, and eventually I will release this as an XD file so you can all grab it and poke around. Hey, Christina from Belgium and Mahesh from India, great to see all of you. All right, let's hop over to XD. And we're going to get going. Now, this particular design doesn't really have a set dimension, right? It might be used for various purposes, potentially even a mobile experience, possibly. So you definitely have to choose the right template and preset that fits your project, right? So I'm going to go ahead and let's try a 1920 by 1080 pixel artboard. We'll probably have to shift it around a little bit. And Rob says, Congruent Media says, hi from Syracuse. Hi, Congruent Media. Wonder how many people are watching right now from Congruent Media. I love when there's like watch parties and stuff. It's cool. Thanks, Wade. And hey, Cornell, great to see you. All right, so we're gonna get going. Now, we're gonna start by kind of setting the scene for this, because I just bit my own tooth. You ever bite your own teeth? Weird. Humans are weird. I find that it helps if you add the background that it's going to ideally be displayed on. It helps design. It kind of helps your creative juices get going. And of course, if you don't have much time, then you can definitely, or you have too much time, you can definitely start blocking things out. But I'm going to kind of go for it. And I'm going to start with a background of some sort. So I'm going to draw out a rectangle back here, right? And what I might want is, I might want to start with the color. Now, of course, you can also do this on the actual artboard itself, but we're going to start with something like maybe a gray, like something like this, right? And we can almost imagine that it's maybe a concrete wall. And I think to really sell that, we might want to bring in a texture. So if I duplicate this shape, Command and Control D, I'm going to hop over to Finder. And I do have some concrete textures, which I grabbed from Adobe stock, and I can just pop that in there. Now, you might be asking, well, if you just put a texture on top of that colored background that you just worked on, what's the point, right? We're actually going to be using this texture to, we're going to be using a blend mode, right? So if I go over here to the right in my properties inspector, I can set a blend mode like soft to light. And that's going to kind of bring it back a little bit. You can also experiment with different blend modes, like overlay could sometimes work, right? It's a little bit sharper. You can also try just dropping the opacity. But this kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility, especially if you want to kind of have some lighting going on. So if you added a gradient, for example, in the background, right? Maybe the top can be a little bit darker. Oops, I selected the wrong layer. Here we go. Linear gradient, right? So you can kind of see how you can start really getting into lighting and stuff like that. I think for this one, we're just going to keep it nice and simple. Maybe I'll darken this a little bit. And then on top of this, we might want some sort of a plate that will hold the thermostat. Sometimes you have the thermostat just kind of on the wall in the circular form, but sometimes you also have a little bit of a plate. So something like this, right? I'll just pop this in the middle of my document. You can also use the alignment and distribution options at the top to make sure it's perfectly aligned if you want. Hey, Misha from Oregon and Chantel from Ottawa. Awesome. How many GBs of texture is too many GBs of texture? Rob is asking. Oh boy. Sometimes I get a little bit I think I overdo it sometimes with my textures, but try to keep it simple sometimes. Who knows, right? All right, speaking of textures, we're going to move on to our plate. And I think what we're going to probably start doing is we're going to set up maybe like 2 or 3 layers possibly, right? So if we go ahead and do something like maybe just a nice dark color like this, we can also add maybe a bit of a border on the inside. Let's bump that up a little bit, and we might want to maybe drop the opacity a touch, just so there's a little bit of a bevel. Howard's words are lagging. Oh no. It's one of those kung fu movies. Is anyone else experiencing that? I don't know if it's the stream. I'm not sure. Looks like the health is okay of the stream. But hopefully, sometimes if you refresh, it could help a little bit. So we have this layer right here, and now we're going to want another layer. Basically, we're going to want maybe possibly like a chrome texture, and then maybe scratches on top of it. So I'm going to duplicate one more time. And I'm going to go ahead and go into my textures. Kevin says, hi from Denver. I'm going to hop open. Let's try something like, maybe something like this. And maybe we'll switch this over to maybe color dodge. Interesting, right? So you can definitely experiment with things like this. Maybe try maybe this texture over here. Might be a little bit too much, right? Soft light, maybe. Then if I duplicate one more time, what I can do is I can now bring in, let's say, a scratches texture. And then for this one, we can also experiment soft light or maybe screen to get rid of, a lot of the black and just keep some of the white. And you can honestly sit here for hours and just kind of experiment with different textures and blend modes and all sorts of fun stuff. Okay, so it looks like always refresh to see that some of you are having some audio issues, some of you are not. So it might be YouTube. I'm hoping it's YouTube. My stream health looks okay over here. I'm gonna blame YouTube. Why not, right? All right, so we have some of our layers in place. We have our plate. Definitely gonna adjust this a little bit as time goes, but I think it looks okay. Now what I want to do, I want to actually start working on the thermostat itself, and it's going to be made up of a bunch of different pieces, mostly created with ellipses, right? So I'm going to go ahead and grab the ellipse, shortcut key O, and we're going to draw out our first ellipse. Now we're going to make sure to keep in mind that there's going to be a side down at the bottom, which we're going to get to shortly. It's going to be, they're going to have shadows, probably an indent into the actual plate in the background. Tim says, could this rectangle be more squirkly? Probably a reference to my video. It could, right? It could. All right. So we've got this selected. Now, the first 2 elements that we're going to be creating are going to be the kind of chrome bevel that goes around this thermostat. So we're going to start by kind of setting the color of this particular shape. So I'm going to pop open my fill, and I'm going to switch it over to an angular gradient. And this is going to really allow us to kind of add some nice highlights and shadows, as Chrome often has, right? So let's go ahead and just kind of place a few of these points around this shape just by clicking in this area here. Sometimes it's nice to actually have the first and last the same color. So I might select this guy here, copy that hex code, and select the first one and paste it just like that. And now I can really go through and maybe, darken this a little bit. I can also add in a little bit of color possibly. Right, maybe we'll brighten this up on the side a touch. Again, add some color. Over here, we might, brighten it up even more. Maybe there's light. Houses often have lights at the top of on the ceiling. So there might be more light on the top of this thermostat than there would be at the bottom, right? But with Chrome, you'll often have interesting reflections and all this fun stuff, right? So we'll start with something like this, and we'll see kind of where that takes us. We might have to make some changes as we're going, right? It's already kind of looking chromish, right? But what we might want to do now is we might want to add a little bit of more of a highlight at the top, and then of course we might want to add a texture on top of that, because why not? We got to get those GBs going, right, Rob? I think it was Rob that was talking about all the textures and stuff. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add an inner shadow. Now, of course, instead of an inner shadow, we actually want to highlight. So instead of, this nice dark color, we're going to actually switch it over to white, and we're going to maybe keep the Y value at 3, but we're going to bump the blur down to about 1 or 0, right? And then experiment with the opacity. That'll just allow us to add a nice little highlight right here at the top. But of course, as our design progresses, we might go back and we might fix that a little bit, or, increase the blur, decrease the blur, all sorts of fun things we can experiment with, right? So we have this shape looking pretty good. I'm going to name this color, and I'm going to duplicate this just like I did previously, and we'll just name this texture. And now we want a texture. There are a lot of weird characters and things being pasted in the chat. Don't know what that is, but I don't know. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and hop back over to my Creative Cloud libraries. You can also, grab a texture from pretty much anywhere. Also, if you go to Adobe Stock, right over here, there is a free section right at the top, and you can look for something like Chrome. There we go. We got some Chrome texture, right? So all of these you can use freely in your projects, which is great. Of course, there's a premium section on Adobe Stock if you're looking for something a little bit more high quality, maybe, different type of license, so on and so forth. But I'm going to go ahead and grab this texture and pop it right in there. And what I might want now is to, again, experiment with the different, lighting conditions or blend modes. So we do something like hard light, possibly. Ooh, there we go. Now we're kind of getting somewhere, right? And I can also maybe work on an inner shadow again, maybe this time from the bottom. Something like that. And then we might want to drop shadow at some point, but we're going to get back to that in a second. But did you notice how the blend mode affected this layer? All of a sudden, it's bringing in that angular gradient that we created just a moment ago. So we went from this kind of, flat, not a terrible looking texture, right? But now we're bringing in with hard light or soft light, overlay. They all kind of, overlay is not bad either. They all kind of have a different effect on the layers behind it, which is really the fun part of using blend mode, right? So there's hard light and there's overlay. Overlay kind of definitely brings in some of the darker tones a little bit, which for an element like this might actually help a little bit. So if I go back there and I make some changes, maybe this guy over here might want to darken a touch more, right? Kind of fun. All right, I'm digging. All right, so we've got our, let's call it the bevel. Bezel. I think it's a bezel, right? Bevel kind of goes, I don't know. I think it's a bezel. Bezel's the outside, right? All right. So next thing we might want to do is we might want the actual side of this thermostat. So maybe underneath there might be a little bit of dimension, right? So what we can do is we can actually maybe duplicate this entire group. I'm going to move it down in the layer stack, or just select the one below, and then just kind of bring it down a little bit. So I can maybe drop it on the top and then extend it down below. Something like this, right? Now, right now, it doesn't really look like much. But what we want to do is add, change up the color, maybe change up the texture a little bit so that it kind of looks like it's underneath this thermostat, right? On the side of it. And naturally, if there's light on top, like on your ceiling shining down, even kind of on the side, then the side of this thermostat and the bottom is going to be a bit darker naturally, right? So the first, let me change this to side. And texture is fine for now. Let's go ahead and hide it for a second. But the color layer, instead of an angular gradient, we might want something a little bit more simple. So we might want maybe a radial gradient. And there might be a little bit of a highlight kind of towards the bottom, possibly. So maybe we'll move this down a touch. And then maybe this color will be a little bit lighter. And then on the sides, it might be a little bit darker. Very subtle, right? Something like that. And you can already start to kind of see that we have a little bit of depth going on, right? Which is nice. And then we can also add a little bit more depth with maybe an inner shadow. Now this time will actually be an inner shadow. So we'll swivel the color over to black, and maybe we'll drop the Y value instead of 3, which is right now at the top of the shape, which we can't see, might want to go the other way. So something like maybe -10, right? And then the blur, right now it's very harsh down there, as you can see, right? So there's no inner shadow and there's inner shadow. Might want to actually blur it in this case. So maybe we'll also do 10. So it just adds a little bit more of a shadow down there. Again, something we might want to go back on later on if it starts to look a little bit funky. Now the next thing is we're going to grab that texture, turn that texture back on, because the side is probably still going to be a little bit reflective, right? I'm going to probably turn the inner shadow off for this particular layer, but experiment with the blend modes again. So maybe hard light, and then really drop the opacity a little bit. Maybe to about 50%, something like that, right? So it's starting to kind of look like the side, and you definitely want to go back and maybe make some changes, maybe darken this a little bit. Something to that effect, right? But one thing that we're also going to want to add that's definitely going to interact either positively or negatively with this side piece here is a shadow. And that shadow is probably going to go on top of that, right? So I'm going to actually let's grab this layer, this group one more time. I'm going to duplicate it. Oops. And these will be our shadows. So what we're going to do is probably going to want 2 different shadows. We're going to want more of a close shadow and then one that kind of goes a little bit longer. So I'm going to drop this one a little bit. We're going to change the color to black, and I'm going to maybe just object blur it just a touch. And you know, sometimes using the actual drop shadow style on objects works, but I often like to create shadows separately. That way I have complete control over the blur, I have control over the gradient, I can also add another shadow using an inner shadow or a drop shadow. So sometimes, depending on what you're designing, you may want to have your shadow layers separately. And I might also want to experiment with the blend modes, like something like multiply and so on and so forth, right? And then we're going to have one more, which is definitely going to be pulled down quite a bit. There we go. And we're going to do basically the same thing. So we're going to maybe change this over to multiply. And we might want to, and by the way, I'm going to get back to that smaller shadow in a second, which looks very bad. But I'm going to apply a gradient. And then maybe towards the bottom, it might fade away. And I'm definitely going to blur this one quite a bit more than the previous shadow. So maybe something like 8. Right? There we go. Again, still not looking great, but we're going to go ahead and add a gradient here as well. Pull that down a touch. Yeah, this shadow's looking a little bit funky right now, but it will get there. All right, maybe drop that a little bit. Drop the opacity a little bit more. Definitely have to, experiment with these shadows a touch. They're just not, it's not looking great just yet, so we're going to get back to the shadows. But let's go ahead and move on to the actual thermostat in the middle, where all the controls are, the display, and all that fun stuff, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our, there we go, the main display, right? So we want a little bit of a bezel around it. So we want something like this here. And this is going to be a very simple shape. It's going to have basically a border and also, a color in the middle. So we'll do something like, maybe we'll add a little bit of blue in here. There we go. And then we'll add a little bit of a border, possibly on the inside or outside. Definitely have to experiment. And then I'm going to drop the opacity a little bit. And what this is going to do, if you take a look, let me zoom in here, right? Just by adding a border on the outside of this shape and dropping the opacity, it's created what kind of looks like a bevel, right? Now in this case, I think it is a bevel that we're looking for. The other one is a bezel. Very confusing. And we can also add possibly, a drop shadow underneath it, but in this case, it might be a highlight. Maybe no blur, right? And then experiment with the opacity to kind of give a little bit of an edge down there, which will definitely look better zoomed out a touch. Right? Something like that, which doesn't look too bad, but I might leave it as is for now. All right, so we have this looking pretty good. And what we're going to want to do now is we're going to want the middle section. And this is actually going to have a little bit of a texture to it. So if I duplicate this shape, I'm going to move this on in. Something like that. There we go. And what we're going to do here is we're going to basically have just a very simple texture. And if I go over to Finder, I do have a texture right here of these LED bulbs. I believe I found something similar, or this one exactly, on Adobe stock. And if I pop that in there, it looks okay, but it doesn't look great at the moment, right? So what we're going to do, again, we're going to experiment with some blend mode. Something like soft light doesn't look too bad. There we go, right? So things are starting to kind of get pieced together, but they're still not there just yet, right? So we're going to kind of work on this. We kind of want this to blend in a little bit more, right? So if I duplicate this shape, what we're going to want is I'm going to actually move it back a little bit, and we're going to change this. Let's change this over to normal. More textures. You never have too many textures. You might want something like this. Maybe at the top it'll be a little bit lighter, and then towards the bottom it'll be darker. And this will kind of allow those bulbs to blend in just a little bit, right? We don't want it to blend in too much, but a little bit. But if we want it to blend in a little bit more, we can definitely drop the opacity. Let's try about 16. And then we're going to have to go back and make a little bit of change to the screen, right? There we go. We're getting it. What do y'all think? Brunel's asking, what happened to letsxd.com? Oh, that was a while ago. So all that content transitioned over to an internal site at Adobe, the XD Learn Hub. So if you want that content, you can definitely go over there and check that out. All right. So we're getting there. We have a screen, we have a few different pieces, we have our bulbs, and I definitely want to make sure that this doesn't blend in too much. So I'm going to bump that up a touch more, and there we go. All right. So I think now at this point, before we move on to things like highlights and the cool and hot meters at the top, let's just add some content, maybe some text and all that fun stuff. So right in the middle, we probably want one text layer that shows the current temperature. So if I press the letter T on my keyboard to grab my text tool, I can type out something like, I don't know, how cold is it? 62 degrees, right? That sounds very cold. But I'm going to make sure that's nice and large. And there are a lot of different typefaces we can potentially use for something like this, but we want to keep it relatively clean, right? So if we do something like blending, that's probably not going to work. Let me just change the color to white for a second. And center. That's probably not going to work. It's fancy, and some of you might see it fine, but if you're just walking by your thermostat and take a very quick glance at it, you might not really know what that says, right? And it, 59, difficult, 71, it probably won't work. Something like, can I adjust property inspector height? So the property inspector over here to the right, it's stuck there. So unfortunately you can't, the layers over to the left, that you can adjust. But property inspector stays where it is. So I think something like, if we want to get a little bit fancy, but also, stay a little bit simple, something like maybe Factoria could potentially work, right? And you can experiment with the different weights. Medium isn't too bad. I think that could work, right? And you can kind of go through the numbers and see that they look not bad. The 4 is a little bit whatever, but it's not bad. I think it could work, something like that. And then we may also want a few additional pieces of information on this section here, right? We might want to indicate whether or not the temperature is cooling or heating. So if we duplicate this up a little bit, where did my mouse cursor just went? Banana. Oh, what is that? I don't. Okay. Okay, so here we go. So we're gonna go ahead and sorry, I got distracted by the chat and then my cursor went flying. I'm gonna go ahead and this text is gonna be a lot smaller, right? So we're gonna drop this down quite a bit. And we'll type out something like cooling. And maybe for this particular text layer, we might want to set it in all caps, something like that. And we're probably going to want to drop this even more. And then maybe bold it. Either bold or semi-bold. Something like that could potentially work. And you definitely want to make sure that as your text layers are getting smaller, that you stick to something a little bit more simplistic, right? So if you were to go back to Factoria here, it's not bad, but it also kind of looks like a football jersey of some sort, right? So it probably doesn't work for a text layer like this. I would probably also argue that using Factoria for this large text layer potentially doesn't work, right? You might want to go with something even simpler. But we're going to stick with this for now, and then maybe down here, we might want to indicate maybe that eco mode is on, right? Which I don't know if it makes any sense considering it's cooling. Usually eco mode is like off, right? I think. I don't know. And then maybe this piece text layer here, I might want to just shift that to something like a greenish blue. That could work. I'm going to make sure to save this color in my document assets. Just like that. There we go. And then maybe at the top, we might also want the time. All right. And then finally, to kind of wrap up this main screen area, down at the bottom, considering eco mode is on, might be some sort of an icon to, activate or turn off eco mode or go to settings or something to that effect, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hop open. Let's actually try our plugins. Look up Leaf. Do we have any? Oh, this one here is not bad. This is from Font Awesome, which is great. Drag that in. Maybe I'll go ahead and sample the same color here. And then maybe we might want like a little bit of a half circle around it just to give it a little bit of style, right? And I was tempted, because I know Rob is still here. I was tempted to add some textures to this leaf, but that just might be overkill. Might want to do something like that, right? Let's add a bit of a border. And then to kind of grab a chunk from this, so it only kind of goes from about here to maybe to about there. I'm going to increase the gap. Let's try about 2000 just to get rid of it. And then I can slowly bring back the dash, right? And this will allow me to then rotate this. Look at that. That's fancy. Group that and call this leaf. And I also want to make sure that I'm grouping all of these elements here, just so that I have everything nice and organized. Now, when we do get to the point where I'm going to be showing you the Super Ellipse plugin, we're going to have to ungroup some of the features or some of the layers, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But one other thing we might want to do is maybe right around this section here, we might want possibly, like an indicator that indicates that shows how much is cool, where the cool area is, where the hot area is, something to that effect, right? So I'm going to go ahead and maybe duplicate this shape here, which is our texture. This will be our color. I'm going to duplicate either of these, I guess, and bring this on in. And what we're going to want is we're going to want to create that kind of hot or cool to hot meter. I don't even know what do you call that thing? Don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open my fill, and we're going to switch it over to an angular gradient, just like we did before, right? And this will kind of allow us to get that blue to red going on, right? So I might want something like, maybe the blue will start somewhere in this area here, right? And we'll do red kind of, maybe I'll swivel this around. Actually, this one's going to be, so I'll do red over here. Those two cannot be separated. And then down here, we're probably going to want it, similar color, but we're going to want it to fade out eventually, right? And we'll do the same thing down here. We want the blue and then fade out. maybe a little bit less of a fade. And we'll do more blue up here. And we'll do more red. Make sure I have the same color on both ends of this angular gradient. There we go, something like that, right? Now, obviously, there's a big problem, right? What if I get rid of this? Let's see. It's not bad. It's not too bad. It kind of potentially works. We're going to see, right? But obviously, there's a big problem. We don't want all of this red and blue kind of smack in the middle here. So what we're actually going to do is we can actually, there are a few things that we can do. One, we can duplicate this. We can bring this on in a little bit. Let me change the color. Right? And then we can select both these layers and boop, do something like that. We can use our boolean option. Another option we could have done is essentially created basically what we have back here. We have our texture and we have our middle section. We can basically duplicate that and then bring it on in the center, right? But I think this could work. And what's nice about this is completely non-destructive. So I can dive into this boolean object and just make some changes. And then what I can also do is experiment with the blend modes, because if I wanted to kind of bring in some of that texture of the bulbs in the background, I can choose something like maybe soft light, probably not that, maybe color dodge. That's a bit better. Now, of course, when you start working with blend modes, colors interact differently with every blend mode, right? So I'm looking down here at the bottom. Even though this is supposed to be like the coldest of the cold, it feels a little bit too blue and overpowering. So I might just want to hop in here and just change this a little bit. Maybe pull out some blue, shift the color a little bit, something like that, and potentially do the same thing for the red, right? There we go, just so it's not too overpowering. And I might want to add a little bit more red up here. And maybe a little bit more blue here. There we go. Is that too much blue? I don't know. I think it could work though. That could work. All right. And of course, now that we've added some additional elements, we might want to go back and, make sure that things are in the right place, things are sized properly and things like that. Now, one more thing we could potentially do using an angular gradient is we can add some sort of an indicator as to where this currently is. So where is 68 on this thing? There are a lot of different ways we can do this, right? We can, of course, use something like an ellipse. We can do something like that. We can really make it fancy, right? We can add additional chrome and we can add all sorts of interesting things, which we might get to in a second. I'm gonna leave this over here. What we can also do is if I duplicate, let's grab one of these layers and paste it up here, right? What I can do is I can create another angular gradient and essentially just kind of, maybe I can actually swivel this over, right? Change this to white, drop this in opacity. So it's probably not the ideal method, right? But you can do something like that. Would you want to? Does it make sense? I don't know. Then of course you can do the same subtraction method in this area here and you have some sort of an indicator, right? You can also use a similar technique to what I showed earlier. Let me change this, get rid of that. Border, right? Something like this, maybe on the inside, increase the size of this border. Take the gap up to, let's try 2000, and then add a little bit of a dash, right? Something like that. And then you can rotate it. So you have that option. Now, of course, the other option is to get a little bit fancier with, more textures, more chrome, more, right? And maybe we'll do that. And what's nice is we have a lot of these elements already that we've been designing. So we can kind of pull the properties from those elements. So I have this piece here, right? And I might want to mimic that bezel on the outside. So if I select the color, I'm going to copy that to my clipboard, select this one and paste appearance, or there's a shortcut there as well. I'm going to duplicate, grab the texture, and paste the appearance, right? Now, of course, because it's a much smaller object, we're going to want to make sure to edit any styles that might be present. So the inner shadow, -4, definitely not going to work. So we might want to do something like that, right? And then here we have an inner shadow of 3. It looks a little bit strange, so we might want to, revisit that. But I might also want to duplicate this, and maybe we'll have a little bit of a more simple shape in the middle, right? So we'll do maybe let's try a radial gradient. Something like that. We want to keep it very subtle, especially for an object this small. And we might want, similar border to what we had earlier. Ooh, look at, almost kind of looks like a knob or something like that. Although this might, would it make sense to have it kind of like outwards or inwards? So concave or convex, right? I think that's what it is. And if that's the case, if we want it inwards, what we might want to do instead is do it like more of a linear gradient, and possibly on the top it'll be darker, and the bottom might be a little bit lighter. So it kind of gives that impression that there's a bit of an indent, right? So you can kind of put your finger in there and then swivel it. Would that make more sense? I think it might. I think that might make more sense. And of course, we'd probably want a shadow underneath this. And this is a case where you probably don't need a separate shadow. You can probably just use one from your properties inspector. So I might want to bump up the opacity a little bit and then experiment just a touch with these options here. Something like that, right? Now, one thing that I've definitely run into a lot is when you're designing very zoomed in, aside from the whole perspective thing that I talk about all the time, is things may not look that great when you're zoomed in, right? The inner shadows and the inner whatevers and all these different things, they don't look great. So you can either helps to make some changes, or what you might want to do is just zoom out or hit the play button at the top, just to kind of see where things are looking, right? It's not bad, but I definitely want to make some changes. Maybe at the bottom, there might be more of a shadow. And then we've got the highlight up here at the top, which looks okay. And this here, does the border even make sense? I mean, maybe. We can also try a lighter border. No, probably not. Or we can try a drop shadow, which is more of a highlight. A lot of different ways we can go. But that's not too bad, right? I think that could potentially work. So again, it looks not great when you're zoomed in like this, but when you're zoomed out at like 100% or whatever it might be, it starts to look a little bit better, right? All right, so I'm going to make sure to group some of these elements, and I'll call this, what is the thing even called? Circle. It's a terrible name. All right. Let's go back to down here. So, right now it kind of looks like this thermostat is just kind of floating on this metal plate in the background. So one thing that we're definitely going to want is, this is the plate, right? Yeah, this is the plate. Is we're definitely going to want some sort of an indent. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this shape here. I'm going to make it a little bit larger. Just like that. And we're definitely going to want to make a few changes. So up here at the top, we're probably not going to see much. Oh, Rob says dial. It's probably what it is. Dial. Thank you, bro. All right, so we're going to want a little bit of a highlight down here at the bottom. So we might want a linear gradient. And the top, we're not going to see much of the top, so we'll keep it, fairly dark. And towards the bottom might be a little bit lighter, just a little bit. And then we might want a border, right? Maybe a dark border, maybe on the center this time. And then drop the opacity. So we're starting to get a little bit of a bevel going on. And then possibly even a drop shadow. Whoops. But again, not a drop shadow, more of a highlight down at the bottom. experiment with the opacity, maybe drop it very subtle, right? Something like that could potentially work, right? So now it almost looks like we might have to shift this a little bit. I might also need to change the color up there. But it almost looks like there's a bit of an indent, right? In this plate in the background. So that helps a little bit with the whole floating situation, right? But we also might want to revisit the shadows, which were looking a little bit strange. So I need to figure out exactly how to make this look not so strange. So possibly we might want to drop them behind the side, but then it kind of goes behind that. I'm going to check just for a second. Yeah, so I had the shadows above. Okay. We'll stick with it. I guess we just gotta make sure that we have, so this is the little shadow at the top, right? Let's experiment with this a little bit. Drop the opacity. And then this larger shadow, you can definitely kind of see that it's casting the shadow kind of as if the lights are kind of above, which is more or less exactly what we want, right? There we go. And that's getting there, right? Now, once we have all of this, let me just make sure that this is kind of on the right angle. I think that could. And one more thing we can possibly add. Right now, the screen is looking a little bit matte, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but many times, you know, these screens are very reflective. So we might want to add a little bit of a highlight over top of this screen. So if I select maybe this layer here, which is, I'm going to just call outline, I'm going to duplicate it and move it to the top of everything, right? So I use that, the Command, Shift, and then square bracket, right square bracket shortcut to move it to the top, or you can right click, and then you have all these options down here at the bottom. I can use, there are a few ways we can do this, but one way, pretty simple, is a linear gradient. I might want to make this a little bit diagonal. And then at the top, that's where the highlight is gonna be. So we're gonna set this color to white. We're gonna add another stop somewhere maybe about here, also white. And then we're gonna add one almost immediately after it. So you might have to zoom in to really see these stops here. This one is also gonna be white, but the opacity is gonna be dropped basically to 0, right? And then down at the bottom, you can either kind of keep it at white and then drop the opacity a little bit, or just drop the opacity completely. Now, obviously it doesn't look great right now. And that's again where blend modes comes into play. So you can do something like overlay, which overlay you gotta be careful with, because overlay definitely interacts a little bit more with vibrant colors. So if you have some vibrant colors in the background behind these objects, it's going to intensify them just a little bit more. And in some cases like this, you probably don't want that. So something like soft light will do something very similar, but it won't kind of mess with those vibrant colors, as you can see. So here's overlay and here's soft light, right? It blends in a little bit more with overlay, but it does kind of mess with those colors. So you can try, hard light's not gonna work in this case because we're using pure white. So I think soft light with a dropped opacity will kind of get us, right? And we can maybe experiment bringing this up a little bit, just so there's a little bit more of a highlight at the bottom. It doesn't work too well. So I think we're gonna keep it at that. And then, you know, maybe just for Rob, we might want more scratches, more textures, right? Duplicate one more time. Let's go to my textures. Now this is definitely overkill, but sometimes you just gotta add some more textures, right? Boop. Maybe screen, drop the opacity. Probably not, right? It's probably overkill. And if your thermostat is that scratched, you have problems. So someone's saying overlay looks better. I think in some cases, I mean, if you drop the opacity, it's not terrible. But again, it does kind of bring out the vibrancy of these already vibrant colors. So, you know, in some cases it'll work, some cases it won't. There we go. All right, let's get. Might want to make a very quick change to maybe this plate. I'm going to hide the scratches for a second. Let's try dragging this in. I think this texture might work a little bit better. Possibly. Possibly not, I don't know. Add a little bit of a radial gradient, maybe down at the bottom. Maybe bump this up a little bit. Drop this a touch. All right, that's not too bad. And then maybe if I could bring the scratches back, will that be too much? Maybe not. Very subtle scratches. Who's been touching the thermostat, Rob says. It's true. All right, now what I was going to do is I was going to wire this up a little bit and prototype it, just a touch. But before I do that, I do want to show off the Super Ellipse plugin, which I just did a video on, and it uses this exact example, right? Now, the Super Ellipse plugin, if you're not familiar with squircles, let me do a very quick rundown of what a squircle is, right? So here is a square. Right? Here's a square. Here's a rounded rectangle or a rounded square. And here is a circle. And, you know, these shapes are fine, but sometimes you want something kind of in between where it's a little bit of a circle, but a little bit of a square. And you can't really get that with just the rounded corners, right? So there's a plugin called Super Ellipse. And this will essentially help you create one of those shapes. Many people call them squircles. I think it's an amazing name. So this will allow you to create a squircle, right? And it works with ellipses. So if I delete this and I create an ellipse instead, use the same nice bright blue, you're going to notice when I have an ellipse selected, over within the properties inspector here, I can control its transform value, which is going to also convert it into a path. But watch what happens when I do that. It's basically taking this circle and slowly converting it into more of a rectangle or a square shape, right? But it also has those nice rounded corners that kind of make it a squircle, which is a really interesting shape. So the idea of the video that I uploaded to YouTube was that if you're working on a project like this, which is, you know, very circular, but you might want something a little bit more rectangular, but, you know, in that squircle realm, you can use a plugin like this. Now, it doesn't work inside of groups. So what you can do, you can either, you know, select multiple objects in a group and then do it that way. Let me actually unlink these. Or you can just ungroup everything. So let's just ungroup everything for now, just so we can do it all at once. And this is the, now this one won't work very well. So I'm gonna leave this, I'm gonna actually hide this for a second and hide this. So if I go ahead and I'm gonna select all of my ellipses, right? Including this highlight at the top. And if I hop over to this plugin, I can now transform all of these circles at once into squircles. Look at that. And even the side at the bottom is looking kind of fun. So all of a sudden we now have this thermostat that looks completely different, but also very similar, right? So we have our circle and we have this. Let me actually go ahead and duplicate this just so I don't lose the original. So one more time, I'm going to transform this. Look at that. That's fancy. And I do see a little bit of a shadow back here that I might want to deal with. Where is it? It's here somewhere. Where's that shadow? Or maybe it's a board. No, it looks like a shadow. I will. Oh, it's the object. There we go. Thank you, Wade, for posting that link. Now, this element here, the hot and cool. Now this one won't work immediately because it is inside of a Boolean object, and it only works directly with circle, right? So if I go over and go inside this Boolean object, this should work. Now, the end shape, I mean, it's not bad, right? But that kind of idea definitely fits better with a strictly circular design, right? This, again, not terrible, but it looks a little bit different and a little bit strange. So you might want to kind of configure the user experience for this. But up here, I think this works. And if we wanted to maybe wire this up a little bit, what we can do is maybe duplicate this. And the idea is that we can maybe have a drag trigger to kind of move this dial around. Now, if we were to just grab this and move it to the next location, it's basically, when we wire it up, going to go from here to there. So what we're going to want to do is place it into a larger group with a circle that kind of encompasses everything. And we might be able to use this circle here, or a circle on top of it, or one of these other circles, right? So if I duplicate this, let me change the color so we can all see it. We can do something like this, so it kind of lands right in the middle. And if I select both of these objects and group them, and now I can rotate basically along that path, right? Look at that, fancy. But of course, we don't want to see this big red shape. So I'm going to just grab the opacity and drop it down to 0, which is very important, because if I were to simply hide the shape, you're going to notice the bounds of that group now hug this shape here, which completely defeats the purpose. So what you want to do, you want to keep that shape visible, but you want to grab the opacity and drop that down to 0. So the bounds still remain around all those objects, and we can still accomplish what we wanted to, right? So in this, let me actually just duplicate here, or copy here, paste it there, and that looks good. Bring the highlight back. And then on this one, maybe we will start kind of towards the bottom here. And here we will rotate to the right. And then to wire this up, if we go into prototype mode at the top, what I want to do, I want to select the object that will move, right? So in this case, it's the dial group. And I'm going to drag this blue handle over to the second artboard. Instead of a tap trigger within the properties inspector, we want to choose drag, which is going to automatically default to auto animate, because we do want this to animate. And if I play this, if all goes well, we can rotate. Look at that. Woo. Fancy, right? And if I drop it over here, it's going to stay there. Now, obviously, the text isn't changing. So there are a few ways we can do this. We can either, over here, just basically change the text to, I think Rob said 87, right? We can do that, which is going to be very simple. It's going to basically fade away. Or we can do somewhat of a masking trick. Now, I don't know if we're going to have enough time in like 1 minute to pull this off, but let's try, right? So if I go ahead and, so we'll keep the 6. And then we're going to duplicate this over, and this will be 60. Let's try it, start at 60, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Maybe I'll center. Yeah, I'll center this. And then what we want is, we only want the 6 and the 0 to be visible immediately, right? Let's make sure it's centered. So I'm going to grab a rectangle, draw it over top of these 2 objects. Select all 3 of them, these guys here. Object mask with shape, just like that. We're going to call this numbers. We're going to copy this over to this artboard here. Of course, if I was using components like I should have been doing, then it would just update automatically, which live and learn, right? Delete, paste. And then inside of here, what we're going to want to grab these numbers. Let me move the highlight so I can just grab this directly. Oh. No. Okay. I'll do it this way. What I can also do is just command click in until I get those numbers. Yeah. And then let's go to 68. Perfect, okay. And that way, when we do this drag again, woo, fancy, right? The mask works. There we go. Cool. All right, that's gonna wrap things up for me for today. A big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I'm gonna be back next week with another Adobe XD Masterclass. Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few minutes, and I will see you all next time. Thanks, everyone.